Thank you, everyone. And I'll begin by saying that it's wonderful to be invited back here again. And I join the other speakers in thanking the organizers for their many months of stress in putting all this together. So the basic point of what I'm going to talk about today is that although obviously both the thought, being the logos, and the action or the praxis are important, their relation to each other, in my opinion, is that of a brain and the limbs, respectively. They can't really be independent of each other, so to speak. And I'm of the view that even the most powerful, threatening, strongest body in the world is useless if there is no power to its brain. That is, its decision-making and its coordinative control. What this means on the plane of ideas is that if your basic ideas are muddled or not there at all, then you can't ignite the proper actions you need to take. The impulses have to be processed even in the most simple mind before, for example, you could swing a punch at somebody. Although there are some pubs in Wales where I've seen men who can swing punches without any real activity to the brain at all. I hear they have the same problem in Glasgow. But seriously, what I want to emphasize today is the importance of a truly infectious logos. A spark of an idea that can transmit an enormous power simply by communication to those in a position to act. And you could say then that this is a talk on kind of memology and transition, if you like. I call it infectious logos with the realization that I probably should have called it viral, because when a principle or a call to action or an idea hits its intended audience in exactly the right way, then the effect really is viral in how it spreads and how it gets things moving. And this does actually relate somewhat to my talk from last year, which some of you will remember, in which I said that we need to formulate an orthodoxy or a creed to build something solid in order to create a continuum of ideas. And following on from that, the reason we need to build a central orthodoxy, a vanguard in physical terms, is because of what I will tell you about today, the infectious logos, the electrical impulse that shoots from the brain and into the arm so that it can move after a decision has been made that it will. So let us begin by dissolving any populist delusions we may have. The kind of ideas I'm talking about seem to pretty much always originate from one individual. In a political or metaphysical sense, that individual, or perhaps a small group of individuals, tend to be patrician or elite in some way, or they've forged their own path to the elite. It may seem odd to once again draw from the recent Middle East to illustrate my point, like I did last year, but I think that this really is a good example of a very recent comparison, or an example of how an infectious logos can be used to spit in the face of a more powerful foe. In this case, the good old gay, the global American empire. Just a few weeks before last year's event, the calamitous, haphazard, embarrassing, and wasteful American withdrawal, or we should say rout, from Kabul took place. In fact, we have some friends from Afghanistan here with us today, don't we? And I couldn't resist incorporating this into my speech last year as an example of how a relatively small, comparatively weak, technically inferior organization was able to prevail over a decadent global hegemon due to its totally rigid, unified creed, its orthodoxy, and its unfailing belief in a metaphysical system beyond this earth. I want to use the same example again, but this time as an example of the power of infectious logos. Your average fighter in an Islamic army, such as those that won in Kabul last year, is quite likely illiterate. This does not mean to say stupid necessarily, or without cunning, but he's probably not what we'd call a Quranic scholar or a reader of esoteric texts or war manuals or fourth-way geopolitics or anything like that. Aside from certain basic impulses, what's kept him and his comrades in that battle for 20 plus years? Against a foe, superior in every conceivable way, but one. That one being a certain kind of infectious logos. I will now take you to a sleepy, sweltering, dusty, quite middle-class neighborhood of Cairo sometime in the early 1950s. Cramped over a desk in one of the old, squat, flat-roofed townhouses is a sleepless, weak-chested, quiet, and often depressive man studying his holy book, the Quran. And all around him, and as they are all over the rest of the world, he feels that faith, truth, integrity, and good traditional societies are being slowly taken over by Western, mainly American, money and ways of life. So what could such a man do? He had no political power at that time. He had no allies in the government at that stage. He had no real money. He was too riddled with weakness and issues with his lungs to go leading any military campaigns. So instead, he consigned himself to the desk and made interpretations of the Quran, and he wrote political essays. And he set out, ultimately, to combine faith with a sense of duty and a need to rebuild the societies of old in the face of a creeping but militant westernization. He knew that ultimately no one would be able to defeat the empire with soft force or rhetoric alone, and the disparate anti-Western elements needed a unified credo. As the years went on, he continued to write. He gained a few disciples, spoke to a few imams and university professors, and eventually he ended up annoying the wrong man in the government, and they hanged him on trumped-up charges in 1966. But over time, his carefully crafted words found a new audience. They gave certain sects ideas on how to act and what to do and how to resist what was happening to them. The Logos became infectious. He breathed a new, unifying, and militant life into a religion and a cause that until then was uncertain of what it could or should do at the time. For better or for worse, he quite purposefully set in motion a mechanism that, in the word of one American military scholar, set us irrevocably on the path to September 11th and the wars in the Middle East. So think of that, a man hunched over a desk in Cairo in the 50s and the shocking imagery of the planes hitting the towers. Now, his name, if I can pronounce it, I have enough trouble with English, is Sayyid Qutb, I believe. I don't know if any Arabic scholars are in the room, can correct me. But, and as I said, some of you will remember that I used that example back in February at the Nomos event. And it's effectively because of what he wrote back then that contained certain strains of the traditionalist, the militant, Islamic movements that are still basically able to battle the West today, because he gave down that viral set of beliefs. He drew it from a pre-existing faith, and at the end of the day, it was the more powerful side in terms of money and guns that ended up fleeing from Kabul. They, the US, at the time, had no real logos. The reason they were there was muddled, and after 20 years of bloodshed and force and money, all that money and all those guns and all that bloodshed couldn't save them from a weak brain, so to speak. I'm sure most of us have seen the film Apocalypse Now, and you'll remember, in the words of one Marlon Brando as Colonel Kurtz, that war is, I'm not going to do the voice, that war is horror, and you must make a friend of horror. Sayyid Qutb and the Islamists who drove out the US knew that. All victorious forces know that. But the Western coalition was not prepared for that kind of struggle, although there were many advisors and wise men who said over that 20-year period that otherwise, if they didn't have that, they wouldn't win. And I will add, by the way, I'm not pushing for any particular one side in that conflict specifically. I'm not about to announce the formation of the Welsh, the Taliban movement and head off into the Brecon Beacons. But I'm using it as a recent example, as a case study of how a single scholar with the right thought and the right expression was able to influence such enormous actions. The right logos, we could say, becomes the perfect action. Less recently, perhaps the ultimate example to illustrate what I mean by infectious logos might be the spread of Christianity through Europe and the East. Although there were some notable exceptions to this, and by and large, Christianity did not have to conquer its way across Europe, it traveled fast because of what Christians refer to as the good news, the fact that Christ had defeated and triumphed over death. And remember that Christ didn't leave behind textbooks and theories and documents. He wasn't a sort of French, academic philosopher with his mounds of paperwork, but rather he left behind disciples. And the manner in which that spread, by way of preaching and telling, effectively set the stage and much more for the next 1,000 years of history. And in order to illustrate a further depth to this, I found the following quote from one Chesterton. Christianity arose and spread in a very cultured and very cynical world, in a very modern world. Lucretius was as much of a materialist as Haeckel, and a much more persuasive writer at that. The Roman world had read God and My Neighbour, and in a weary sort of way, it thought quite true. It is worth noting that religions almost always do arise out of these skeptical civilizations. A recent book on the pre-Mohammedan literature of Arabia describes a life entirely polished and luxurious. It was so with Buddha, born in the purple of an ancient civilization. It was so with Puritanism in England and the Catholic revival in France and Italy, both of which were born out of the rationalism of the Renaissance. It is so today, and it is always so. Go to the two most modern and free-thinking of places, Paris and America, and you will find them full of devils and angels, of old mysteries and new prophets. Rationalism is fighting for its life against the young and vigorous superstitions. So you see, it only takes a small number of sayings or ideas to completely upend an established order. If Logos catches the wind in its sail, then great action is perhaps inevitable. Let's look now for further illustrations at our education systems in the West. That infectious spreading of ideas is not just something one has to try and encourage, but there at times needs to be a defensive or perhaps a counter-offensive way of thinking. You can compare, if you like, before we go on, the fierce struggle between Luther's Reformationists and the counter-Reformationary Catholic Church. The pro- and anti-Reformationist ideas were argued at extreme depth among clergy and professors and theologians, but they were also crystallized by certain figures into a kind of electrical energy in Logos that disseminated down into the lower orders and became action. And more recently, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, our elite institutions, and I will say that just as there are hierarchies in all things, so there are hierarchies in those institutions too. So, for example, if you're going to stage a coup, you stage it in the capital, not in the provincial post office. That's why we're dealing with Oxford and Cambridge, etc. That's why these things had to be captured before the others could fall. So in those colleges, there were extremely reactionary, ultra-conservative dons and rectors and professors, not just small c conservative or a bit old-fashioned types of people, but metaphysically inspired, often Christian men who could see where modernity had gone wrong and had all the rhetoric to challenge it. If in physics you can have potential energy, then they had a kind of potential infectious logos. They all had a kind of circle, a quite powerful gang of minds, if you will. And there's quite a wonderful satirical novel. It's out of print now, I think, and there was a film made. But it's called Porterhouse Blues, and it's obviously about Peterhouse College, Cambridge at the time. And there's a very poorly recorded talk as well by Jonathan Bowden on Maurice Cowling, who was perhaps the most famous figure of that type. I've got to tell you about him because it's difficult not to, but he was a very clever, sort of intense man, and he used to get in trouble all the time. He used to make people wear morning dress and black armbands on the anniversary of the death of General Franco, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah. And he was someone who fought very hard against things like the admittance of women to the college. And when women were finally allowed to enter, he was known for basically academically terrorizing them. And, he would tear up essays, and they would go weeping down the steps of his sort of great Dracula-like tower at the top of Cambridge that he had his tutorials in. And I'm getting distracted here, but it's worth telling. He used to invite sort of illustrious African or Chinese or Israeli dignitaries from various embassies and think tanks and that kind of thing, and then organized a kind of a banquet, which was basically an extremely racialist roasting session sort of thing. And it used to get them in enormous trouble. And I will say, before we get back on topic here, that if you think our little sort of Discord chats or telegrams or whatever are spicy, then find somebody who went to those Cambridge dinners back in the day and talk to them, because you wouldn't believe it. But yes, to get back to the point. So Professor Cowling, Peterhouse College, and the conservative philosopher Michael Oakeshott was also quite close with him. And that's also where the late Sir Roger Scruton got started as well. But the thing about all these figures that relates to us today is that in 1968 and sometime after, as sort of, rowdy, sort of hard left Trotskyist Marxist students paraded round and had their sort of, sitting in classrooms and occupying and that kind of thing, these figures, the ultra-conservatives didn't really take it seriously. And that really is why universities and schools now are full of these quite sinister progressive ideologues. Cowling and Oakeshott and later on Scruton didn't employ their enormous rhetorical skill or practice of any kind. They and the other conservative establishment figures didn't or couldn't organize against this. They sat sort of feasting in the keep of the castle while the barbarians marauded around and smashed the place up, basically. And what didn't seem to occur to them is that all this very radical subversive stuff was coursing through their institutions like strychnine down the vein of one's arm. And all these precocious young women and sort of beardy, clever, sort of radical hippie types, they all got their degrees, they got their masters, they got their PhDs. And now, of course, it is they who get to decide who gets a master's and PhD. The reason that the average teacher now in a university, or average professor, or average educator in general, is such a non-entity, such a tool of the regime, is because that's how they've been selected by the ones who can really think and know the strategy and know what they're doing. Remember that the progressives, leftists and radicals, or whatever we call them, don't really care about the masses in the lower orders. The masses for them are just a tool. They deliberately pick the most pliable, soft, indoctrinated, controllable, and weak-minded types to follow their course and become the lower-ranking teachers, professors, and educators. And again, that's why a coherent doctrine of words, meaning, and action is so vital. That's how you capture the important institutions, and that's how, if they tried to do so, the old guard could have kept those radicals out. And it took us on the right, I think, far too long to wake up to the basic tactics and rules of power. Far too long to realize that we couldn't just rest on non-existent laurels and laugh at all the funny, slightly strange-looking communist students. The same thing that happened in those colleges back then happened all over the West between 2016 and 2020. Those SJW types, the spiteful mutants, as Edward Dutton calls them, they weren't just fools and firebrands, they were the next wave of the Maoist revolution. And by that, I mean that each wave of young revolutionaries has to clear out the one that came before in order to preserve the momentum and disallow any tranquility under which the forces of order or reaction might come into power. And many of us sat and laughed at those sort of blue-haired freaks, but we didn't quite understand what they meant and what they were willing to do. And I don't think we quite understood that they already very much had the regime on side, which again stopped us from taking them as seriously as we should have. And it wasn't until those calamitous regime-approved riots over the death of a certain individual outside a convenience store in Minneapolis in 2020 that many of us woke up and realized what was happening, and that we couldn't laugh or reason our way out with those people. Just last week, I was out with several friends at the National Museum of Wales down in Cardiff, where the portrait of Sir Thomas Picton, a great Welsh military hero and aristocrat who was killed leading an attack at Waterloo, has been, quote, reframed and left on the floor in a wooden packing crate, surrounded by screeds and signs telling you what a villain and a racist he was. The reason that has happened is because of an effective logos. The white British national hero who stood for something in opposition to leftist destruction has to be brought down. And thus, the destructive praxis is manifested. We live at a time of extreme, perverse social conditioning, as we are all aware, and that logos conditions the population into a kind of submission, in which the foreigners are allowed to cry shame and force a once beloved national figure onto the floor and into the wilderness. And remember that just about everything that you see and hear around you is in some way ideological. Everywhere logos is being given out and actions are informed thusly. Mass media and television understands this perfectly. AA and myself and some others were discussing the fabled return to Fresh Prince last night, or the idea that the regime will simply put the woke culture war genie back in the bottle and go back to a more peaceful, docile era, so that the elites can go on doing terrible things to the world just in secret. And those screens that pump out endless bilge to the masses and convince them of the glory of their materially abundant lives are a form of infectious logos. But it's a logos that prevents a kind of action, or perhaps encourages the action of doing nothing. I've said before that if all the people in this room were given access to all the TV and the newspapers and all the various forms of programming, we could completely reshape society in 3 weeks, maybe less. Maybe even less than that, because the law of power throughout human history has been that if you control the belief and the educative structures, you can disseminate your logos and your control, your orthodoxy, and your metaphysics. That's more or less what everybody thinks and how they think about it. That's why churches often seek and require the power of the state to back their words, because how else do you shut down heretics and dangerous individuals? We in the West don't really need state apparatus and secret police and all that sort of Eastern Bloc Stasi type thing, because the mechanisms of dissemination and the control of the logos has become a far greater tool of suppression and control in and of itself. The West doesn't bother to ban books because 40% of the population can't read them anyway. This is how liberalism rules. It doesn't allow the privilege of dissent because it disprivileges the dissenting ideas. And if people can't think, and those ideas aren't worth anything to them anyway, then we become invisible. And therefore, you don't need to persecute. You can put economic pressure on people, so you get a choice to be you can be decanted from bourgeois life for being an oppositionist. Think of Alex Jones being ordered to pay an obscene amount of money because he opposes the regime. Does anyone here remember exactly how much that was? 40 million, 50 million, or something ridiculous like that in legal fees and fines? Does anybody remember, that's one of the pressures that the state puts on people, and it's done deliberately to stop people who have an education forming in their head, or forming a brain, or forming a vanguard, forming an elite with a fist, such that we need. And that's done quite deliberately, you see, so that the leaders will be choked off. And it's all in the power of the denial of the logos. And let's not forget, if you turn on a television today and watch a program on any of the major channels, if it's some sitcom or comedy set anywhere in the UK, for example, the cast will be overwhelmingly, quote, diverse. It doesn't matter whether it's in the middle of sunny Coventry or a tiny village in the Pennines, they will consciously fill the screen with a certain vision of the world, their metaphysics, their logos. And the reason they do this is because it's a weapon. It convinces the population that this is normal and that things that are happening are good and healthy, and it removes the ability for them to challenge these events and the elites behind them. That's why our task is so vital. It's not that we have to disseminate a logos capable of turning the masses over to us, yet. Let's not fall for the populist delusion. But we must have something capable of pulling in desirable people to our cause and bringing in power without losing them because we didn't properly distill our messages. I was very pleased when clear them out became the kind of vanguard phrasing of this group because of its simplicity and its directness. But think how even that simple phrase took quite a lot of time to actually manifest. There was a lot of questions that had to be talked about. We had to decide various things, work out exactly what we were trying to do and who we were against and what exactly had to be done first. Clear them out. And it was said of the late Jonathan Bowden's public speaking skills that it was he and only he who could explain a nebulous philosopher like Heidegger to the man in the pub. And indeed, when Bowden spoke to an audience in the back room of a dingy East End pub, he hit on the point I was building to just now. He said, "But these attempts at great philosophical theory, abstract and radical though they are always like Icarus in a sense. They go up and down. Because mark my words, every politician and every pundit, no matter how low level, no matter how 200 times beneath this sort of discourse they are, is actually replicating ideas that have come from somewhere and are going somewhere. The reason why you walk around London today and you see the world as it is ideological in the broadest of senses. Because a man who has any sort of belief becomes the equivalent of 50 men in action." Remember that line when we think about how we go from here. A man who has any sort of belief becomes the equivalent of 50 men in action. Our task, in terms of logos and praxis, words and action, is to balance the equation. To come forth with a credo capable of taking us forward and making us do incredible things. The talent is all here, I believe, in the room with us, and it can be done. I ask you the same thing I did last time. What are we? If we can unify our disparate strands into something whole without homogenizing them, then we will have the most powerful weapon. That is what I will leave you with today, and I hope we have plenty of time for questions, so thank you very much.